Okay, here's my audience. Breonna Taylor, Emmett Till, and many more have been victims of terrible crimes where after people saw that there needed to be a change. How do you conflict change if every time you try to, you get shot down and told that it's not going to happen or it doesn't matter? At some point, you have to take it into your own hands to get them to notice you. Boycotts and riots are a form of protest, not violence. Over my lifetime, I have seen many of these protests and riots happen, but the one that impacted me the most was the George Floyd incident. The day it happened, me and my family were driving down into Minnesota, and we watched the whole thing happen on the news. Once we got into the city, we saw many of the riots and peaceful protests that were going on all over the city. Many of the protests started peaceful, but people came and they ended up being very violent throughout the downtown of Minnesota. Many of these cases have happened all over the U.S., and everyone in this room has either heard of a case or been alive for a case when there has been many riots all over the U.S. People are using riots to get the point that they are trying to get across, that they need change. This is why riots and boycotts are a form of protest and not violence. This country has been hit hard with many controversial issues, and this has led to many 21st century riots. This has also led to people having many different ideas about them, especially when it comes to Omaha. When these riots happened all over Omaha, you would hear many different opinions about them, whether they were violent or they were helping people. When the peaceful protests happened, nothing with the case seemed to change. People were chanting up and down streets, but police officers got a paid leave. This is when the riots started to happen. People saw that their voices weren't being heard when it came to peaceful protests. It was time to take the matter into their own hands. They thought, if they aren't going to listen to us yelling, then we are going to have to do what we have seen work in the past. Once the riots started, things started working in the way that people intended it to. And the case started to work in the way that people wanted. People have seen these things work in the past, so why wouldn't they use it now? We also saw this exact thing happen in Omaha when a bar owner shot and killed a 20-year-old man who was downtown. According to the Washington Post, this was in 2020 and possibly the worst time for this to happen. There were already peaceful protests all over Omaha going on for the George Floyd incident, and this just added on to it. These peaceful protests, yet again, did nothing. They moved from peaceful protests to riots, and this is when they saw that the things that they wanted to happen started working in the way that they wanted it to. We have also seen where different issues have used only peaceful protests and have not gotten what they wanted to get to with their intention of the protest. We have seen many people all over the country protesting for Roe v. Wade, but in the same states that we saw these peaceful protests, we saw no change whatsoever. This makes you realize how impactful these riots are. Because without them, the government might not listen to us and your voice might not be heard. Why keep doing something if it's not working? Why don't we use what's worked in the past? When people see riots, the last thing they think about is the protest, and all they think about is the violence and how we're hurting communities. One of people's biggest offense when it comes to riots and boycotts is that they're hurting the communities around them. But when people say this, they aren't really thinking of why the people are doing it. The Black Lives Matter movement is where we have seen riots happen the most, and we have seen them work time after time. But while fighting communities may get hurt, this shows the extent people will go to have their voices be heard when it comes to people dying in their communities. They would rather come together to revamp their communities later on than keep seeing their people die in front of their eyes and in front of the whole country's eyes. People also like to defend riots by saying that Rosa Parks and them wouldn't like them. This is actually very false, though, because when Rosa Parks did not get the seat on the bus, this led her to get sent to jail. This led to many boycotts. People sat outside of buses with signs, and this led to many fights at bus stops. This was very violent, and many of these would lead to even more people in jail. This was very violent, and many fights would lead to even more people in jail, which is exactly what happened in the 21st century riots. People of color also did not ride the buses anymore, which led to bus drivers' pay being cut in almost half, according to the Washington Post. This hurt the drivers in their communities because they weren't spending money in the places that they usually would. Many people also like to defend riots with Martin Luther King. While King did not participate in violent protests, he led the peaceful protests and agreed with what people were doing when the violent protests started. He would cheer them on from the sidelines because he knew what they were doing was going to help them in the long run on what they were fighting for. The government has a lot of power over the country, and when a case or something that is going to impact a lot of people happens, they aren't going to be able to hear everyone's voice. So when acting in groups, they are more likely to hear how we feel and what we have to say. Riots are a disturbance of the peace created by a group of people. When these riots happen, the government is able to see and hear what we have to say. These riots aren't always going to be able to solve our problems when it comes to getting the government's attention and when making crucial decisions. While riots may take protesting to the next level where our First Amendment no longer protects us, it is worth it because we are getting the government to change things in our favor, and we see that we get to see everyone's side of things. I could give you 100 examples of when riots have worked for people all over the country, but the biggest factor that we can look at is how they have worked in looking back on some big decisions that have been made in our country. Because of this, Roe v. Wade, LGBTQ laws, and integration in the U.S. have all changed over time. Violence isn't always the answer to your problems, but getting your voice heard might just be the problem. While it's not okay to hurt people, having to make a little destruction when fighting for something you believe in makes it a protest. Many of these riots have led to where we are today in history, and without them, we may have never seen the change that we did in our government. When it comes to things that we feel strongly about, it is important to speak up. Riots and boycotts and the many other ways that people have been able to voice their opinions are just another way that we have been able to see change in our government and have them hear our voices. Thank you.